Good afternoon. I'm George Latimer, Westchester County Executive. This is Monday, November 2nd, and this is our weekly 2 o'clock update on the outbreak of the coronavirus here in Westchester County. As we're speaking to you today from the county office building in downtown White Plains, Governor Cuomo is also conducting his daily update. Normally he does it earlier in the day, but since it's being done at the same time, if there is any breaking news that affects Westchester in any of his reports, we'll share that with you here in our report. Our plan today is just to go over some numbers. We have our Director of Consumer Protection, James Maisano, who is with us here today, and I'll give him a proper introduction. He's going to talk a little bit about some of his work to deal with some of the issues that started back in March relative to the coronavirus pandemic. And then we're going to touch on just a couple of other things, primarily with Election Day coming up, Election Day security, and we'll give you a weather report before it's all over. In any event, we'll start with the numbers, and the numbers continue on the same pattern that we have discussed over the last few weeks. It continues to show a high level of infection, but not yet a severe level of infection increase from where we are today over where we were before. That creates more people testing positive out of the base of people that are tested overall. And the more positive cases we have, the higher our number of active cases are. Active cases are the number of people that have tested positive within the 2-week period of time from wherever we're speaking, because that is the incubation period of time of the disease. So during that 2-week period of time, nobody's really cleared of coverage, no matter how healthy you feel. If you tested positive, they're isolated and monitored during that 2-week period. Those numbers have been rising on a steady basis now for a number of weeks, and the percentage of infection has increased. However, we'll talk about our hospitalizations and our fatalities to give you at least a framework of how all of these work. So the tracker that's produced by New York State that tracks all of the different testing and other data from all of Westchester and all across the state has not been updated for today. So we're working off of Sunday numbers for November 1st, 40,946 positive cases year to date for COVID. 39,476 of those individuals passed the 2-week period of protocol. So that leaves us with, as of Sunday, 1,470 active cases. Our most recent hospitalization data comes from Saturday, the 31st, where there were 51 people hospitalized in Westchester for COVID, and we have 1,472 fatalities year to date because of the COVID outbreak. Now, to give you a sense of the trend line, because that's really what's important here, the absolute numbers, if you can't compare them against anything, really doesn't tell you anything other than the fact that there's been a certain amount of infection that goes back to March. Here are some of the indicators that we look at. First of all, active cases, which I just described a second ago. We have 1,470 active cases as of the first day of November. I'm going to take one day earlier so I can deal with an end of a month. The day before that, we were at 1,399 active cases as we ended the month of October. When we ended the month of April, we had 7,679 active cases. At the end of May, it had dropped down to 1,257. That was the point in this pandemic where we had flattened the curve and we were on our way back down. So at the end of May, 1,257. By the end of June, we were down to 480 active cases. That number was relatively flat because at the end of July, on the 31st of July, we were at 470 active cases, very small difference. And at the end of August, we were at 498 cases, still relatively all about the same amount. As of the end of August, 498 cases. As of the end of October, 1,399 cases. So you can see that number in active cases is rising, and it rose to the level roughly that it was at the end of May, active cases. Now, people say, well, you've tested a lot of people. The more people you test, the more likely you're going to have active cases. Two other factors go into the raw number. One is the rate of infection. Out of the number of people that you test, how many of them test positive? And the target numbers that we have seen pretty much run like this. This past Sunday, we had a 2% infection rate for that day. 2% of the people tested that day tested positive for COVID. The day before on Saturday, the percentage was 1.9. The day before that on Friday was 1.7. Earlier in the week, Tuesday, almost a week ago, 2%. A week ago today, Monday, 1.6%. A week ago Saturday, 2.1%. The Friday before that Saturday, 1.4%. You see some oscillation day to day, but it's in a relative range, give or take 2% infection rate. Now, when we looked at some of the spikes in other parts of the state, certain zip codes around the state, we saw infection rates of 9%, 8%, 7%. Those are far higher than what our infection rates were. And so give or take 2%, that number is still in a manageable format. But as a comparison, let's go back to Labor Day weekend, which was now almost 2 months ago. On the Saturday of Labor Day weekend, the infection rate for that day was 0.9%. 0.9%. On Sunday, it was 0.8%. So a 2% ratio compared to an 0.8 ratio is 2.5 times as much. So the percentage of people out of all those tested that have tested positive now has increased as a percentage. It has not reached a number that's in the high single digits to be at a point where we have to start shutting things down, but it is significantly above where we were 2 months ago. And that's the important question, is where are the trend lines going? What direction are we heading in? I lean back on my business experience, which admittedly is a bit dated now, and it wasn't only where were you that day, but what's the trend line going ahead, and then what do you do about that trend line? Let's talk about hospitalizations. Our last hospitalization number was 51 people hospitalized on Saturday, this past Saturday, Halloween. 51 people hospitalized in the aggregate across all of Westchester's hospitals, hospitalized for COVID. So let's give a perspective. Last day of the month of April, we had 817 people hospitalized. Last day of May, 242 hospitalized, big drop. Last day of June, 64 people hospitalized, and even another big drop. Then the last day of July, 45 people, obviously about a third less than it was before, but now the numbers are getting very small at 45 people hospitalized. On the last day of August, 26 people hospitalized, the number's still coming down. 2 months later, the last day of October, 51 people. So we're up 25 over the course of a 2-month period. And you see the decline and now the rise. Now the rise to 51 puts us still below where we were at the end of June, nowhere near 817 or 242 people, but the trend line has gone back up. And now the question is what will happen as we go forward. Let's talk about fatalities. I always caution, every time I talk about fatalities, I do not want to trivialize the loss of a human life, any human life. These are people, I say this all the time, there's people who were loved, who loved people, who were important to them. They were neighbors, friends, relatives. So we don't want to turn them into statistics. That would be a moral outrage to do that. But because you need to have some idea of what kind of volume of this has happened, in the month of July, in the aggregate, we lost 20 people in Westchester County to COVID, 20 deaths during the month of July. That number in August went down to 7, and in the month of September, it went down to 4. 4 people in the whole month of September passed away in Westchester due to COVID. October, the number is 16. So the number has jumped back up from the lows. It hasn't yet reached what July was. And if I went back into June, of course, and if I did April and May, we had tremendous numbers because we got to the 1,470 death total because we had just horrific numbers in the month of April, particularly, and then in May as well. But the trend line is coming back up. Now the question is, does the trend line stay that way? Or does it flatten out again? Or because we're going indoors, because we have certain things that happen at the holiday season. We get together for Thanksgiving. We get together for Christmas time. Do we expect to see an increase? Those are the questions that we ask ourselves when we look at the numbers to try to determine what do we do about it. One of the concerns I have, it's very subjective, is that to the greater extent, most of the community activities, the public activities, have stayed at a very low level under the certain limits. We've had certain rallies, political rallies of both the left and the right that have exceeded those numbers. But to the greater extent, we have shut down events that we're accustomed to going to. I'm going to bring Jim up in a few minutes. Jim spent over 20 years as a Westchester County legislator. I spent almost the same amount of time. And we were naturally out at community events. Throughout the month of September and October, there'd be a host of events and activities, fall dinners and things that banquets of various sorts, events at senior centers that we would normally have gone to. And that would have clustered lots of people. Those things are shut down. But when you see that the virus spreads, that means it's spreading in a non-public way. It's spreading more in a private social way. And that is a concern because while we may have a rule of what we regulate, what you regulate in the privacy of your own home is up to you. No one from the county government is coming into your home to tell you have too many people in the backyard. So now, as we head toward this fabulous time of the year where we celebrate Thanksgiving, we celebrate Christmas holidays for those who observe Christmas. Before we get to that, we have Veterans Day, which is normally an important event for us to honor our veterans, and they cluster. When we look at that clustering, we have to ask ourselves, are we prepared to do all of the things necessary to stop the spread? And this isn't because government wants to run your life. The last thing I want to do is wear this mask every day. That's truthfully. And to remember to have to sanitize my hands almost every time I turn around, to sanitize my phone, sanitize the wheel in my car, all of these things that could, in theory, spread the virus. But the numbers are not giving us comfort. They're not spiking the way they were in the spring, but they're not flat, and they're not continuing to go down. Or the way I put it last week, and I've repeated this line a few times in a week, we're not fear-mongering, and we're not sugarcoating it. We're trying to give a realistic picture of where we are as befits some of those numbers. When we go to questions in a few minutes, we'll be happy to answer any questions we have from our friends in the media who are remote. The governor has highlighted, and I think we all are focused on, looking for potential clusters of infection where we see a concentration. You may recall 2 months ago now, we had a concern about a church in Pleasantville. 4 months ago, hard to believe it's that long ago, we had a concern about a cluster in Chappaqua that fed around a high school graduation. Those things are in a rearview mirror. We passed the test of those activities. All of our summer, open the pools, open the beaches, we passed all of those tests. But we are still looking for those areas where there's a cluster of cases, and they generally come from family transmission. If you go back to the original case in New Rochelle, the first person who was identified as having had it gave it to members of his family and to his next-door neighbor who drove him to the primary hospital. And that began the first cluster of one person having the disease to 8 people having it. And then through the religious entities that he attended, it spread from there. So these clusters, to monitor it comes all across the county. Generally speaking, wherever there is a higher population of people, a higher density in people, are the areas where we tend to look for those clusters. And we also look for them in situations or circumstances where we think that either through some social event, perhaps some religious event, that these things might be advanced. When we find the clusters, we intend to work with all of the players in the community, the local elected officials, the major business people in the community, because what the governor has pointed to is moving into an area where we shut down every activity within that target zone. And we have to make sure that we're looking at the right target zone. You can't do it just by zip code, maybe by census tract, but maybe not even by that. You have to look at where people congregate and where they live in order to know what you're restricting in the circle that you create. We have to ramp up testing whenever there's a cluster to make sure we're testing as many more people as possible. That will give us more active cases, but it will also allow us contact tracing, being able to isolate the people that have the disease, and then being able to quarantine, precautionary quarantine, what I went through 3 weeks ago, most of us here, precautionary quarantine of the people who might have been exposed so that the cluster of this size doesn't become a cluster of that size. And that's where you go from having 50 people hospitalized to 200 people hospitalized. That's the concern that we have. We have at this point of our conversation today, on this date, we have not had any identified clusters in Westchester County, but we're on the lookout. We know we have large urban centers. We have densely populated areas, maybe smaller in population, but densely populated enough that could be a cluster. And we're going to try to be as ready as we can. As we did 2 weeks ago when we announced that we were intending to apply a mandate to wear masks in schools, we will use our authority very lightly. We're not looking to shut things down for sport. We want to make sure that we've done our due diligence. We're still looking at issues that relate to youth sports and scholastic sports and local recreational sports. So we're not trying to come in and clamp down on things, but we want to make sure that the protocols that are in place are actually being followed, because you can have a sheet of paper that tells you what you intend to do but not do it, and that could lead to the cluster. So that is what we're most concerned about. I'm going to shift gears now so that I can talk a little bit, very briefly, about our consumer protection operation. I am very grateful and very proud that Jim Maisano is our Executive Director of Consumer Protection. Jim and I served together as county legislators at some point in time. When I went on to serve in the state assembly, we worked together. And Jim and I have different political parties, but I've always seen a tremendous talent in him. And when the opportunity came, I asked him would he join the administration to run the Consumer Protection Department. He gratefully accepted. He didn't have to do it, but he gracefully accepted it. And he's done a fantastic job, I must say. He's taken the bull by the horns. He has the right balance of legal knowledge. He is a lawyer and a practicing lawyer, but he also has a good understanding from his time in public service as to how you deal with people and how you try to get an outcome using all of the tools at your disposal, not just the prosecutorial tool or the enforcement tool, but also the tool of persuasion, the tool of sweet reasonability and insight. So I'm very happy that Jim is doing the job he's doing. And I want to talk a little bit about a challenge that was given early on. When we saw the first cluster in New York State, it was right here in Westchester County. It was in the city of New Rochelle. Jim is a resident of New Rochelle, not geographically near where the cluster was, but he knows the city intimately, and every back alley. I think the two of us sit and we figure out what's the fastest way to go from A to B, and we both have opinions about how to do it because we both know the city that well. But there were some actions that were taken that seemed to us, outside looking in, that were prejudicial because of the community. And so Jim, knowing his task, decided to tackle that, and I want him to come up and tell the story a little bit. So without any other further ado, our Executive Director for the Department of Consumer Protection, the Honorable Jim Maisano. Jim?
Thank you, Mr. County Executive. Nice to see you today. Yes, exactly as the County Executive laid out, I got a call from both the County Executive and the Mayor of New Rochelle, Noam Bramson, back in early March, the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. Seems so long ago now. It really does. He asked me to deal with this issue that retailers were refusing to deliver into New Rochelle because of the containment zone, despite the fact both the mayor and the governor, and I believe the county executive as well, all made public statements that it was okay to shop, for businesses to move forward, and for deliveries to happen inside the containment zone, and of course the whole city of New Rochelle. So we got into the issue. We began fielding complaints from citizens at first, and there were 8 complaints that we felt were really ripe and really well laid out for our office, and we took those 8 complaints on from 8 New Rochelle residents who national retailers refused to deliver to. Me and my team and the inspectors, we went through it in great detail. We had looked at the law, and we deemed these 8 situations to have violated the Consumer Protection Code of Westchester County for being an unconscionable trade practice. Based on that, we served complaints because we did have a hard time reaching these national retailers. A call from me or one of my inspectors didn't necessarily get a call back at the beginning. So the act of filing the complaint started the process. And then, of course, we heard from lawyers on behalf of the retailers, and we began a discussion about not delivering into New Rochelle at the early phases of the pandemic. Now, I do want to say that once we explained what happened to these national retailers, they jumped right on it. They wanted to address it. They wanted to fix it. Very little pushback. They realized that mistakes were made and that they had to be addressed. So we had very good, meaningful mediation process with these. There was 4 retailers in total, 8 complaints. We had mediations with them, 1 or 2 meetings. We had phone calls to the corporate offices, to the local stores to kind of figure out what happened. Because sometimes the big retailers hire another company to do the deliveries. They don't make the deliveries. So we had to look through who made the mistake, how do we fix the mistake. So, as the county executive started to say, consumer protection is about compliance. We're not the district attorney. We don't do penal law. It's compliance. So our number 1 goal was compliance with the laws of Westchester County, which included, number 1, making sure that those consumers were made whole. So every single one of those consumers either got a refund or actually got the delivery that they paid for. Every single one of them was made whole. We thought that was the most important part of this process. Beyond that, we used consent decrees to settle the matter with the 8 national retailers. These consent decrees point out the areas of law that we believe were violated, we resolved them without a hearing, that compliance was what the process is all about. No admissions by anyone about what had happened. We just laid it all out, the facts that we knew. So the 2 parts of the consent decrees that were signed by the county and these 4 national retailers was that they agreed that they would comply with all of Westchester's laws going further, and they would not violate any of our laws further, and that they were made aware of that. So that was important, and they paid a fine to Westchester County. The 4 retailers combined paid about $7,000 in fines. Now, that's not that much, but again, it's about compliance. It's about protecting the consumers, and it's about making sure that every business in Westchester County follows the laws on the books. That's our job, to enforce the consumer protection laws. We take it very seriously. I want to shout out to our staff. Everybody on the staff of Consumer Protection was aware of these cases. We took it very seriously because there was an issue of potential discrimination against people in the city of New Rochelle. That made it very serious to the people in our office, certainly to me as a New Rochelle resident. So we took this very seriously. But it was a great result because we worked with the retailers. They took care of the consumers, made sure the consumers were made whole, and we made sure that Westchester laws were complied with. So it was in a crazy 6-7 months of the pandemic, this was, we believe, a success story for Westchester County.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. And I appreciate you sharing those stories with folks so that you could see it. One of the things that's important to understand is how many different elements of county government had to respond in ways that you might not think of for the COVID crisis. When the COVID crisis hit, none of us had any roadmap as to how we would handle this during a pandemic. The pandemic of 100 years ago, the world was different. The structure of county government, the services it provided were different. And so we had to, department by department by department, figure out what is the appropriate thing to do, and to do it in a way that was practical-minded, not ideological. And what you've just heard Jim point to in terms of the work of the Consumer Protection Department, you can layer on department by department. In the health department, they had to go out and do initial testing, and they had to set up a protocol for sanitization, which was used by businesses and schools and a host of other things. Lots of decisions had to be made. Do we keep this open? Do we keep this closed? Based on the wisdom of our health department and the professionals in that department. Our emergency services department became a clearinghouse for PPE, personal protective equipment. They also helped us identify equipment that we announced last week that we obtained to help local EMSs defog, sanitize their vehicles so that they could go out on their rig faster in a turnaround. Our Department of Public Safety, our county police department, had to enforce a variety of executive orders that came down from the governor's office, and how we functioned in a host of different ways in order to keep people safe, socially distanced, and so forth. Our Parks Department, we've talked about quite a bit, what hoops they had to jump through in order to provide as much recreation as we could, golf and bicycle Sunday and beaches and pools and some of the kid camps during the summer, all of which stayed open, even as we had to close some things, but that was the work of the Parks Department. The Corrections Department had to continue to run the jail and make sure that inmates did not suffer from COVID, because you can imagine the kind of an outbreak that could happen in a situation of incarceration at a jail between both the correction officers and the inmates. And that was managed and handled well. Our Department of Environmental Facility handles our sewer treatment plants, and they were involved in part of the research to test wastewater to determine how much COVID was detected in the wastewater coming out of a particular community, help us identify what might be a hot spot. We had our economic development team put together a plan for us to use COVID money as business incentives for small grants and loans for businesses to help keep some businesses afloat. And we did the same thing, identifying resources to deal with people who are facing evictions. And we did the same thing to try to add some additional money for food insecurity, working through Feeding Westchester and some of these, these other organizations. In almost every area of county government function, we've had to respond in real time to things that we had no plans to do as of March 1st. Every one of these things, Jim's work in consumer protections and these other departments, all came from a practical-minded, we have a problem. How do we deal with the problem? And how do we deal with the problem in this iteration and in that iteration? Now, most of what county government does is not sexy. It doesn't appear on the front page of a newspaper. Right now, we're closing out a presidential race where all the attention is on national issues, and everybody understands what those issues are. But the pandemic brought down to your backyard the way we've worked with mayors and supervisors in towns, villages, and cities, the way we work with school districts. That is the function of government, and it is not meant to be, as I would argue, just to make a speech and try to impress somebody. It is just what Jim talked about in his field of endeavor right now, which is to gain compliance. And it does involve a certain amount of penalties, but it also involves the kind of dialogue that's done in a way to get these major retailers who could care less about any one county. I mean, they have customers, they want to keep customers, but they're not particularly quaking in their boots when Westchester calls them up, but to get them to respond in a proper way. And I compliment Jim and his team for their excellent work. And I think in that story that you've just heard is one kernel of how we've tried to deal with this. No fanfare. We're not having any parades. We are not through this thing yet. We've got a long way to go. We'll know when the vaccine comes, when the antiviral treatment comes. We'll know I'm sure there'll be a big parade, a big party when it's all behind us, however long it takes. But it's in stories like Jim's story that is the responsibility of government to respond in each of the different issues that are put before us, and to do it, as I said before, without fear-mongering, making people afraid, and without sugarcoating things to kind of lull people into thinking, well, there's really no problem. We have a problem. We face it as grown men and women. We try to figure out in every field of endeavor, how do we deal with that? And I would say, frankly, I'm particularly proud because many of the people who served in county government as department heads prior to my becoming county executive, I retained those people, and they knew how to run many of these departments. And where we had to go outside to bring new people in, and Jim is one of them, excellent service in the county legislature, former vice chairman of the board, former minority leader of the board, steps into an executive function. Mike Kaplowitz, a former chairman of the board, comes into the administration, steps into an executive function, and performs well. And that really is what's important, and we think, and we're very happy, again, Jim, that he was able to tackle this particular problem, and he's got many more things on his plate. If this was just one element, we'll have Jim back to do his own press conference on everything that they're doing, and there's quite a lot. New legislation that the county legislature has passed that put more work on his desk. So, Jim, please convey to your team how much we appreciate the hard work and how valuable it is. So, with that, I'm going to touch on a few other things very quickly. We'll go to questions and then let you get on with the rest of your afternoon. Obviously, Election Day is at hand as we're speaking today. It's Monday, November 2nd, the day before Election Day, Tuesday, November 3rd. There is no early voting today. Early voting completed yesterday on Sunday, November 1st. You may recall there was no early voting in New York until it was passed by the state legislature in the spring of 2019, and then in the fall of 2019, a year ago. That was the first time we had early voting. We also had early voting in our primary season back in June. We had a terrific result from early voting. 152,000 people came out to vote in advance, and that roughly is about 36% of the people who voted in the prior presidential election. So all the voters in 2016, 420,000 plus Westchester voters who voted, 36% of that total, not necessarily the same people, voted in the 9 days of early voting. And we had days of rain, such as yesterday, such as it poured yesterday afternoon. I was at a number of the sites visiting with people and giving out, free masks and so forth. And people were insistent upon getting their voices heard and their ballots cast. So that led us up to today. No voting today, but as of tomorrow, it's Election Day. Polls open as they normally do at 6 a.m. They close at 9 p.m. You should double-check your local polling place. Some have changed. Some have changed because of COVID. I use an example. There are 2 election districts in my home community of Rye City where people were accustomed to voting at the Osborne home in the auditorium. You can't go inside a nursing facility like that now. So those 2 polling places have been moved to the Osborne Elementary School, which is in the same general area, but not right next door. So if you're watching this and you know exactly where you're voting, that's fine. You can consult our website, get to the Board of Elections. That's one of the departments of county government, and they will go through all the sites there. And depending on where you live, what election district you're in, very few people know what actual election district they live in, but they know, obviously their address, and they can easily be linked. Just to double check so you don't go to a place tomorrow morning, you find there's nobody in the parking lot, and what gives, because it was one of the centers that had to be changed. There's not a major amount of changes, but there are some changes you should check in advance. The general election will close at 9 o'clock tomorrow night. Many people voted by absentee ballot. We understand that the Westchester Board of Elections will be counting the early voting ballots before or at 9 o'clock, and then the machine tallies from tomorrow will be counted. But the absentee ballots won't begin tallying until next week. I believe on Wednesday is what I heard. Hopefully I'm accurate. If I'm off, I'll correct it in next week's update. So depending on how close a particular race is, you may not know the result of that race today or tomorrow. You'll have an idea of who's ahead based on the Election Day voting and the early voting, but not necessarily absentee voting. And because this is not normal absentee voting. Normal absentee voting is you're sick, you get an absentee ballot. I'm going to be on a business trip to the West Coast, I get an absentee ballot. Those are one-offs. We have systematically, because of COVID, large swaths of people that felt comfortable only balloting by mail. Now, you're still before the election. If you still have an absentee ballot in your hands, do not put it in the mailbox. because it may not get to the Board of Elections in a timely fashion for reasons that I'm sure you're well thoughtful about. You have two choices of what you could do. If you live in and around White Plains, or you feel like you want to drive into downtown White Plains, the Board of Elections will take that ballot at their headquarters, 25 Quaropa Street, which is about a block away from where we are right now. If you don't want to do that, you can go to your polling place tomorrow, but you don't have to stand in line to vote, depending on how many people are coming to vote. You can indicate to the election inspector that you have an absentee ballot and you want to drop it off, and that will give you less connective time to do it. If one member of a couple wants to go, they can go and carry their spouse's absentee ballot. You're limited to 5 ballots to carry, so in theory, one person in your family could carry up to 5 ballots tomorrow and drop them off if you choose to do that. If you choose to vote on Election Day tomorrow and you've already submitted an absentee ballot, you need to identify that when you go to vote. You need to tell the people at the desk, I submitted an absentee ballot. You don't get to vote twice. I don't get to vote twice. Nobody gets to vote twice. And then your absentee ballot will be destroyed and you will get to vote on the machine tomorrow. And there'll be other questions you have. Just feel confident that, as I do, that at every polling place, as it was during early voting, you will have masks on. You'll be expected to wear a mask in, and this is no time to have a political debate about masks. No one wants to give or get an infection. There's going to be a lot of people coming who don't know each other in and out of a voting space. Wear a mask. Come in to vote. The people who you're dealing with will be masked. There will be hand sanitizer available for you to sanitize as you walk in, as you walk out. And social distancing will be applied, which will create an awkward set of dynamics. If you're accustomed to voting, you kind of queue up pretty close to each other. You might be out the door, depending on the physical logistics of your local polling place. But social distancing will be enforced by the Board of Elections. The polls close at 9 o'clock. Any absentee ballots that are in, I believe there's a period of time by which they will accept it as long as it's postmarked as of tomorrow, but don't take that chance. Have it dropped off if you can, or vote in person, and then we'll go from there. There are some concerns, obviously, about election security. Both the standard concerns, are ballots safe, are they going to be maintained, or voting machines going to be safe? And then also a societal concern that the divisions that have roiled our society may create, from either end of the political spectrum, some outburst, some activity, some potential violence, or potential disruption of voting. I don't believe you're going to see that in Westchester County. We have had rallies for presidential candidates now, and we had earlier in the spring justice rallies, and not any of them turned into violence, not any of them turned into loss of property or loss of life. So the potential is always there. Obviously, if you have a telephone on you and you feel you're being intimidated in some context, call 911 and let someone dispatch and handle it that way. Hopefully, we won't have that kind of situation happening. I don't anticipate it in Westchester, but we are making preparations through our county PD and the other local PDs to handle any issues like that coming up. I'm confident that our law enforcement professionals will be able to handle whatever it comes up. Our county police department is responsible for doing local policing in Mount Kisco and in Cortland, so you may see county police in those two communities present. County police will be a backup if they're asked for from any of the localities. And then also there are certain polling places which are on county property, and so the county police are responsible for policing those polling places. So you may see a police presence there. Our county's real-time crime center is monitoring social media for any indication of any trouble that's being planned. The county PD is working closely with the state to ensure safety through the state troopers, and we're going to handle any potential civil unrest the way that we normally do it, which is professionally. We're going to look to de-escalate rather than escalate the tensions of the moment. Some people, get agitated, and it's not for me to say rightly or wrongly. We just don't want that agitation to be manifested in any behavior that intimidates somebody else, and we'll try to use all of our talent to avoid that through our police professionals. The weather tomorrow, it's supposed to be partly cloudy. We're going to have a little bit of rain in the morning before 9 a.m., so if you're an early riser and you go out to the polls early, a little bit of rain. Since you're not getting the same level of commutation into New York City, you may or may not get the same rush of people to vote at 6 o'clock who commute into the city. On the other hand, as we saw from early voting, people are very anxious to vote this year. So you may expect to see a lot of people happening. It's supposed to be clear throughout the day. It's going to be cold. Low is going to be around 35 degrees. You get some wind, and but we will get through the day. I also want to highlight, since we do have a windy day here today, Monday, there have been power outages around Westchester County. As of 1:30 p.m., there's over 2,000 countywide outages due to the wind. Con Edison and their communities, 1,500 plus outages. Cortland, Croton-on-Hudson, Austin, and Yorktown. And NYSEG up in the northern portion of the county reports 500 plus outages in Bedford, Lewisboro, Poundridge, Somers, and Yorktown. And hopefully all of those places will be put back up on electricity. We're making a particular effort to make sure that electricity is not lost at the polling places. So where loss of electricity might impact voting and turn off electricity and make it impossible for a voting center to operate, we are making every effort through the utilities to make sure that those places are up and operative. So that gives you a summary of where we are today on Monday, November 2nd. Obviously, if we have any other announcements to make, if the governor has any announcements that affect us directly, we'll certainly communicate back with you. We have a number of other, things we're going to be doing before the week is over, and we'll try to tie in anything that relates to election security. And, of course, the election itself will be reported by the major media outlets, and we'll take it from there. We all of us, whatever our philosophies are, take pride in this democracy. And tomorrow is that day up to this point, and then tomorrow is that day where we honor what is the greatest democracy in the world today. But we have to uphold the principles of democracy even through our disagreements. With that, I'll go to any questions. Catherine Chaffee, our able director of communications, is on the cover of 914 Inc. Magazine with two other members of our executive team, Joan McDonald and Emily Saltzman. Very proud of all three of them. And she may have a question or two. Catherine.
Yes, we received a number of questions about security relating to the elections tomorrow. You've touched on most of them already, but Samantha Crawford from News 12 asks, what specific security will you have around the Board of Elections building where the absentee ballots are being kept?
Well, Samantha, if you'll understand, I'm sure you will, we don't want to telegraph the exact specifics of what our security is going to be. So that we, encourage someone to try to figure out how to get around it. But we intend to have sufficient security and we have a number of Board of Election sites where machines will be stored, and we believe we're going to be, able to secure those machines properly. Oftentimes, one candidate or the other has an order to impound the machines, which freezes them from being dealt with, depending on how close their election is. If that happens, it changes the vote counting realities of things. But we're prepared to secure the ballots as they have it. And because of the machinery that we have, we do have a paper trail if it's necessary. And, let's hope we don't have to use those protections.
Okay. The next question is from Allison Dunn from WAMC. She asks, in relation to preparing for the polls to close and the day that follows, what security will be put in place?
Well, as I said, the election day itself, we have our county police force deployed in specific locations. Again, first level of protection where we have primary policing responsibility, and I mentioned those jurisdictions. And then secondarily, as a backup to police departments that are in charge locally in their communities. Now, you have some police departments in smaller communities that have a relatively small number of police officers, so we generally tend to provide backup in those locations more frequently than we do in the larger police departments. The Yonkers Police Force is actually larger than the county's police force. Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, White Plains, Greenburgh are the other major large forces in the county. And then some of the mid-sized communities and the small communities may be more likely, if they need backup, we intend to be at the ready. And what we're talking about is to deal with perhaps a planned disturbance of some sort that could happen at a polling area. It's important to understand, though, we've just finished 9 days of early voting, where over a third of the people who would vote voted. And as I said yesterday, I personally was at 6 of those locations. And in the urban centers, in Mount Vernon, in East Yonkers, in New Rochelle, in Greenburgh. And I saw no attempt by anybody to disrupt the voting. And we had long lines when I was in Mount Vernon, outside all around City Hall, in New Rochelle, up from Beaufort to Hamilton, leading up to Main Street. No sign of any effort to disrupt the voting. I have no reason to think tomorrow would be different. And in fact, tomorrow, if you disrupt the voting, you're dealing with a smaller cohort of people because so many have voted already. So I don't think tomorrow will be the issue. In terms of protecting going forward, we are not alarmist. We do not think people should be boarding up windows. We hear about this stuff. We saw how Westchester handled itself during the spring and the various justice rallies, after the death of George Floyd. And there were plenty of rallies, 30 rallies, 40 rallies. None of them turned into violence. None of them turned into looting. None of them turned into shooting or anybody being injured or conflict, direct physical conflict between police officer and protester. None of them. We've just seen over the course of the last couple of weeks political caravans, on behalf of one of the candidates. We're going to be apolitical in this context. And those caravans, honking horns, meeting at Playland, coming up the Boston Post Road, coming down from Brewster to Peekskill. No confrontations in Westchester County. They were in other places. We saw the film from Texas, and we saw something happening here and there and everywhere. But here in this county, people kept their cool, and whatever they considered, provocation or not provocation, there were no incidents here in Westchester. So I don't anticipate them on Wednesday if the outcome of the election becomes contested. I think we all understand, because of absentee balloting, because this is a close election, there are 10 to 12 states that could go either way, and you're not going to really know who's won the election until you know what's happened in most of those states, no matter who proclaims what. In public office, people proclaim things all the time. Fine. But so I think it's not necessarily a Wednesday issue, a Thursday issue, a Friday issue. And then depending on lawsuits, and the certification process of electors doesn't happen until December. If there's a debate over that, it gets resolved, in theory, in the Congress of the United States in January. And that's after new senators and representatives come into play. So this is not like, Thursday is going to be the day for something to happen, because Thursday is the day it's all going to come down. We don't know. But whatever happens, we're going to be prepared for it. Our police safety department, under the able leadership of Tom Gleason, has been in contact with the local police departments, the local police chiefs and commissioners out in the field. And we're not cocky. Something could certainly happen of magnitude that could, in theory, overwhelm us. But we think we're going to be ready for what we're likely to face. I'm not the mayor. I'm not the mayor of Chicago. I'm not the governor of Maryland. I can't tell you what's going to happen in a bigger jurisdiction where there may be some controversy in one of the battleground states. But I think in Westchester County we have a reasonable sense of security that we will not be touched by those kind of concerns.
Okay. Allison also asks, any arrests or issues from yesterday's rally on the Mario Cuomo Bridge?
We were not the governing jurisdiction. The state was, so I'm not aware. The county police did not arrest anybody, since it's not our jurisdiction. Where the county police had jurisdiction, Playland Parkway, where caravans either clustered or met, there were no arrests, there were no tickets authorized or given, and what have you. So we had, as a county police department, no particular interaction with any of the folks who were rallying. And look, let me just speak very generally. I mean, people know my personal politics. We don't hide them. Only in a governmental standpoint, we just sort of put them off to the side. Regardless of who I support for president, everybody has a right to free speech. Everybody has a right to free assembly. If your free speech and your free assembly are done in a public place in an appropriate way, if you don't damage public property, if you don't break gun laws, if you don't break other types of laws that fall into the area of intimidation, assault, then you have a right to honk your horn. You have a right to rally. And we upheld that right. We upheld it in the spring. We upheld it in the fall, because that's what we believe. We believe that America is the land where there's free speech. Even if I don't like your free speech, and even if you don't like my free speech, you have a right to that. That philosophy has gotten us so far so good. And I think that philosophy will keep us in the right mindset. As agitated as we get, the understanding that we each have rights to express ourselves, I think, will keep us away from that. So no tickets that we've been involved in were given out. Whatever did happen on the bridge, the state would be the authority to check with, and I would check with the state police to determine what actions they took. What happened on the bridge was far more severe than anything that happened on the ground in Westchester County yesterday. So there's really no comparable. It wasn't a similar group of people on the Boston Post Road or on Route 9 in Hastings or something like that. So what happened on the bridge was different, and it was part of some regional realities, which I read about in New Jersey and Connecticut and so forth. But those actions to stop traffic did not occur in Westchester.
The next two questions are actually for Jim from David Proper
Jim, come
from
on
the
back
Journal
up to the
News.
microphone.
Get you back up there. So David Proper asks, what were the 4 companies that were fined?
Home Depot, Peloton, Pottery Barn, the parent is Williams Sonoma, and Sears.
Okay. And his second question for you is, can you put into context how much $7,000 is compared to other fines issued by your department during your tenure?
Fairly typical. We have a consumer protection code that has a maximum penalty. We usually try to find a compromise when we do a consent decree because it's a settlement without having to go to a hearing. And these fines are similar to all the fines that we do when we do a consent decree, and the settlement's probably I would say extremely similar to our prior ones that we've done over the last few decades.
Very good. The next question is actually for the county executive, also from David Proper. He asks, with active cases much higher, has there been any problem keeping up with contact tracing?
Well, our understanding is that the contact tracing effort has been stretched, much more so than we originally thought. But our understanding is that it has been, in general, meeting the requirements that were necessary. I'm sure there are examples where we may not have reached everybody, because now when we have these many cases coming up, an extra couple of hundred cases a week, it can be a problem. But I think to the greater part, we're dealing with it, and that's why we're looking to see if the rise in cases trigger clusters in a particular area. If there are clusters in an area, that tells us that the virus has slipped out of control in an area, and maybe we didn't get the contact tracing in that area that we wanted to, because person A who tested positive, we weren't able to isolate the individuals that they had contact with, and then the virus spread. But I think at this stage of the game, our contact tracing system, which has over 800 people trained to serve as contact tracers. We have a certain committed group of people at the Department of Health. We have the Bloomberg Initiative that involves a certain number of people. We could, in theory, reach a point to take the question to its logical extension, where if there are enough new cases, where we could have our contact tracing system stressed beyond what we're able to do. But so far, we haven't reached that point.
That was the last question.
Very good. Well, we thank you all for watching. If you have any other questions, our friends in the media, you can direct it to Catherine Chaffee. We'll be happy to talk to you separate from this context and answer any of those questions. Just for your planning purposes, next Monday we will give our general, regular 2 o'clock update on COVID. And then on Tuesday morning, November 10th at 10 o'clock, we will have a press conference to present the proposed 2021 county budget. That budget will go from the executive branch to the legislative branch. They will begin their scrutiny over the next 4 to 5 weeks. Jim and I have many examples of dealing with it, from the 8th floor scenario, the legislative scenario. So now we'll be at that point. And that press conference, again, will be a week from tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I gather we'll be here in this location. And if we have any other announcements, we'll be happy to share it with you. Thank you for your patience in watching this. Stay safe. Make sure, if you haven't voted yet, that you do vote. And we'll look forward to talking to you a week from today. I'm George Latimer, Westchester County Executive. Thanks very much.